Right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining on Zoom or on Facebook Live. It's so good to see everyone for this week's Shake It Up with Shekar community discussion. For those who are joining for the first time, my name is Shekar Krishnan, and I'm a Democrat running for City Council here in our communities of Jackson Heights and Elmhurst, Queens. And I know there's been so much happening, and on both the news has been so disturbing lately too, given the publicity on Asian American violence or hate against Asian American communities and violence and the murders in Georgia too, that this has been such a devastating and painful week. But I also do want to thank everyone who also came out to our community vigil last night too, which was really a powerful display of solidarity in that face of disgusting violence too, and sending a message of how we'll all stand together to protect ourselves and to protect one another and look out for each other as a community, and that we keep our community safe during moments like these that really have been going on through the pandemic and long before as well. And really thinking through, as we did last night, about the work that we have ahead of us and reflecting on what we need to do to really dismantle white supremacy and hate in all its forms. But tonight's discussion is, in addition to all that we're seeing in the news too, of course, right now, there's so many other issues that we're facing as a city, especially through this pandemic and afterwards, that touch on different themes of all intersectional issues, whether it's racial justice, gender justice, immigrant justice. And one of them, tonight's conversation, we really wanted to have a conversation, is about food access and food equity in our city. And this is also, as many of the themes of our community discussions have shown, they all tie together in different ways because they raise much more fundamental issues about urgent crises in our city now. Crises that this pandemic did not create, but exacerbated and revealed for everyone to see. And the food crisis in our city is chief among them too. We've seen during this pandemic the way in which, let's just take a step back for a second and say that we need to be a city where every single community, regardless of race, regardless of income, has access to fresh, healthy food. And especially in food policy work, in sustainable food policy work, we are focusing on and paying attention to low-income communities of color that have not had access to healthy, fresh food for so long because of decades of disinvestment that were deliberate, not accidental, but deliberate disinvestment in our neighborhoods. And when we think about those issues, we also need to think about sustainable farming, agriculture, and the way in which all of these things tie together as issues fundamentally of social justice in our city. In this pandemic, what we saw was that city government completely failed us in that regard. There were so many communities, those hit hardest by COVID, those that were in the news today as not only being hit hardest by COVID, but also having some of the highest rates of eviction cases right now in New York City as well, are also, not coincidentally, the same ones that suffer the biggest crisis when it comes to food, lack of food access and food inequity in our city too. And as I said before, the pandemic revealed it, but the truth is this has been going on long before. But during COVID itself, we saw the way in which, because so many of the communities most impacted by this outbreak were the same ones that weren't getting access to food when individuals needed it most. Homeless individuals, those living in poor communities that didn't have access either to hospital healthcare insurance or access to COVID testing facilities. These are all overlapping and interlocking crises too. And when we think about the pandemic, we reflect on what's been going on, we also know that given these serious inequities, so many mutual aid groups sprung up to really help those who did not have access to fresh food otherwise, and were trapped in their homes with COVID, freaked out about evictions, and were depending on community groups who heroically stepped up to really fill this void of government and make sure that families, especially families in crisis, were getting access to food and to hot meals during this time. But it shouldn't be that way, right? In the city that we live in, given the resources that we have, low-income communities must have much, much greater access to healthy, fresh food. And coming out of this pandemic, I think it's incumbent upon us as a city, as a state, to think about how we reorient food policy to make sure that's the case. But all of the mutual aid groups and community efforts that sprung up They did so heroically, but they shouldn't have to be what food policy rests on in this city. What it really should rest on are access to government resources, funding, and programs that prioritize our most vulnerable communities. And so tonight, we're really excited to have with us two panelists who are on the front lines of this work every day, thinking both about how food policy can be completely reoriented in the city and doing the work every day to fight and advocate for those policies and hold our government accountable to communities most in need. And so that's why I'm really excited today to introduce to you Kiana Mickey, who's the founding principal of QJM Multiprize, and Michael Hurwitz, the Director of Food and Agriculture here at Grow NYC as well, that oversees all of the farmers markets around our city, including right here in Jackson Heights, our very special one that really stands out in all of Queens too. So both are, as I said before, are doing this work every day and have written and lectured and advocated extensively on food policy and food equity and access in our city. So without further ado, I want to open up both of them and to really hear from them tonight too, what we need to do going forward to really address this crisis in our city. So I'll open it up maybe to you, Kiana, first to talk a bit about what is, when we talk about lack of food or fresh food access in our city or food inequity, what are we really talking about? You know, what and how does that center and connect with all of the other crises in our city right now too, from both a racial justice and an immigrant justice standpoint as well?
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, that's really good grounding because I think you touched on a lot of things that oftentimes we have to start. So I think it's a really good way to start. So, you know, when people talk about equity, what we're talking about is fair and just inclusion for all and by all. So oftentimes, if we're talking about food equity, many of us are talking about the right to grow, sell, and eat healthy food. And that's a right. So it's not, it's our active right, our self-determined right. It's how we choose to build our, you know, continue to support a resilient natural environment, how we live in a built environment, but that these are self-determined models of economy, models of production, rooted in justice, rooted in equity, rooted in fairness, and how we choose to build it, to keep it going, and for it to be regenerative. So for us, you know, for a lot of us, meaning like in terms of regenerative economies or regenerative agriculture, many of us speak about food equity. But I think it's also important for folks to understand it's not just necessarily a converse of food insecurity. You know, food insecurity is something that continues to be persistent. I think this is something that we've seen in our city, that we're living in a city of food apartheid. Sometimes people will use the term food deserts. That's not a term that I particularly opt into because I don't really think it's a food desert. And we can get into why or why not. But I think what's important now is maybe to talk about why I think we do live in a city of food apartheid. And to me, food apartheid is the purposeful segregation of resources and the disinvestment of power of the most impacted people, and how with a food lens, we see how it intersects amongst job insecurity, economic security, housing insecurity, and food insecurity. So we're not living in systems organically. Like our neighborhoods are purposely have been divested, and many of them have now been gentrified. Our food channels and systems connecting us to either food being grown in our neighborhoods or food being grown in our region or beyond, you know, those are, again, are purposeful supply chains that we've either been divested from in terms of connecting to it in healthy food access, or who is the decision makers and and how we're able to build our multiplier effect in those value chains. Decision makers, who is seen as an end recipient, who is able to get food, who's able to grow food. How do we share that economy together? How do we build this a good reciprocal nature with each other? So I think, you know, what we've seen in a city that has so much wealth, so much bounty, so much abundance, so many of us are still living in scarcity. You know, 1.5 million New Yorkers are living food insecure. Food insecure meaning persistent food insecurity, not knowing where that food is coming from. And what we've also have seen is historically this reliance And we saw it exacerbated in COVID, this reliance on an emergency model system that's very rooted in large scale corporate ag. So large scale ag production, corporate interests, corporate controlled supply chains, that then that became our reliance to support. So not just how we get a lot of our food into our underserved communities, but then in the midst of crisis, that immediate response was to support that and that only in many ways. And I think then what we started to see is while there was an immediate response, some folks were getting a little bit more food. Farmers, large scale farmers, were now, instead of dumping food, bringing it into the supply chain models. But we also saw bottlenecking. But what also started to be seen was a mask or not a full story of the resiliency of our regional systems, community controlled food projects, regional farmers with small to mid scale, and how we were able to pivot. So I think, what we saw with COVID was an exacerbation of existing inequities, rooted deep inequities, as you had outlined already, and a reliance on a model that is built to just distribute food that's really an offset of surplus food. So there's no choice, there's very little dignity, there's no necessary, it's rooted in donation and charity. And that's supposed to just get to folks in community. So not just the soup kitchens and food pantries that are already built on those models of donation, we started to see proliferation of mutual aid efforts of community-based food folks that may have not been familiar with food systems existing large scale or small that wanted to also jump in. But those again are just Band-Aids to a larger system that's really, again, rooted to offset or build tax incentives for large interests and not necessarily supporting the viability of a community or our farm or regional food shed. And so if we're really kind of looking at what went wrong, we start to see not just a lack of access, we start to see a lack of cultural relevancy in food. We start to see neighborhoods that were already divested from even feeling even much more burden and stretch. And like you said, community folks, not just existing proven models in our neighborhoods like CSAs or farmers markets trying to get food to folks, but we started to see also the stretch of people who weren't, who were trying to do their own, find ways to work out with each other through mutual aid. Again, like a reliance on a model that's not built to dismantle the root causes. Mm-hmm. So we really have to, I think, for me, COVID was devastating in a lot of ways, but it also, I think, shown a light to us to see food insecurity has increased. And 54 million Americans as a whole, that's higher than before. We're looking at higher food insecurity rates even as New Yorkers, a 38% increase from pre-COVID. So what we're seeing is that reliance on a model that large and how it bottlenecked and how it wasn't meeting need is still not meeting the need. And it's not really dismantling persistent and inequity. It's not dismantling persistent hunger either. Mm-hmm. But what we can do is start to look at what was working. And I think if we do, push ourselves to see that, we can see that there was a resiliency in our community, in our connection to our regional food shed, where we were able to be nimble and we were able to pivot CSAs and community-run farmers markets and markets big and small, green markets as well as other community-run farmers markets that are in our community to really try to push how we can change or continue to pivot in food access. But I think what we want to continue to see is how to build a better way to disseminate resources equitably so different food models and food chains are supported to do their work. And so we're really getting out of the mindset of an immediate response and really trying to shift into resiliency and emergent response in order to build into longer, more resilient food systems.
That's such a powerful point that you made, Kiana, too. And two things, and you raised a lot of points that I want to make sure we hit over the course of our conversation too. There were two just starting out with that you really, I think framed the conversation well. One is that access to healthy, fresh food is a right, right? I mean, like it's, I guess we say housing is a right. These are ways to think about these things as not commodities, not, uh, privileges, but actually a right. And the second piece is the notion of food apartheid in this city too. And so on those points, Michael Kenna raised some great points about what happened during this pandemic and how things kind of broke down when it came to government's response as well, or what the work is ahead of us to really, in a systemic way, address food inequity in our city. And so the first question I'd ask you on a more general note is where, both during this pandemic, but also just more generally too, what are the things that government is not doing right now that the city can do when it comes to actually supporting, food justice? Or, when we talk about that, is it programs? Are there benefits that that the city should be investing more in, making more accessible? What are some major gaps right now, and that government can actually seek to address and voids to fill?
Hard to follow Kiana, I will tell you that, but she teased it up nicely. So
I tried.
The reality is there are some things that the city is doing well and just need to be expanded upon. And part of that is figuring out more innovative ways to put money into people's pockets to further their purchasing power, right? And so that, there's a health buck program. It was the first in the nation. That's a SNAP incentive at markets. It's now going to be, for every dollar you spend on SNAP, it's double up, and it's now going to be available at cooperative buying platforms, and we need to make sure that it's available for CSAs as well, right? The city has done a good job equipping certain farmers markets like ours with the equipment to process SNAP remotely. We need to invest in any community program on the ground, any food cart or farm stand or bodega has capacity, or corner store has capacity to process SNAP with the ability to do that. And we need to ensure that they can process SNAP online. We've seen a massive transfer of wealth throughout COVID, right? And we've seen what has happened with supermarkets that have been able to process SNAP online and to be able to do delivery. And our small supermarkets, our small corner stores, our community-based food programs all need that same capacity. Those dollars need to be invested locally. That's how we're gonna get ourselves out of the economic crisis we're in. And like Kiana said, that rather than the emergency food route, it's the investment in our local food businesses and having people have the ability to support them and through their dollars and through their food dollars that builds that sustainable food economy within a community. One of the things we saw was pandemic EBT. I thought that was an example of how that can put additional dollars into people's pockets. Those who qualify for the other thing is, on a federal policy, if you're undocumented, you don't qualify for SNAP. With pandemic EBT, you were able to do that if you had a kid in school. So we need to invest in programs that allow for all to participate and all to benefit from increased food purchasing power, which is something that, again, like the Health Buck program actually does. We at Grow NYC early on, we actually entered the emergency food for the first time. Normally each year we donate 1 million pounds to City Harvest, to food bank, and to other emergency food providers, and that's our role. We actually try to create models that provide available and affordable food that through purchasing mechanisms. Again, seeing that as the model that builds community resiliency and pays farmers the fair share for the products that they're bringing, and is not a dumping ground for the industrial food system. But we, knowing that there was an exacerbated need in the city, that there was a new food insecurity with real new unemployment because of the realities presented by COVID, we partnered with the Department of Sanitation to create a food box program in hard hit and disproportionately hit neighborhoods. We started right here with the United Church Society and expanded throughout Queens, throughout Brooklyn, throughout. But we were in all 5 boroughs. But true to our mission, we wanted to ensure that those dollars went to regional food businesses and farmers. Mm-hmm. So we partnered with a co-op of 22 farms upstate growers and packers, who's a supplier for our wholesale farm, and their partner Russo Produce, and we channeled those food dollars to them. About $4 million between the Department of Sanitation and then subsequently the USDA's Farm to Food Box program stayed local, supported local business. The state of New York created its own program called the Nourish program. It was a fraction of what the city did, but it was designed for those dollars, again, to go towards the economy and to New York farmers who lost a lot of their business with the shutdown of the economy. We were able to utilize those dollars, again, supporting farmers. We're going to talk about this soon. We need to invest in the creation of more BIPOC-owned farms. 13% of our Nourish list are BIPOC-owned farms. It's not nearly enough. Again, I think that what we are doing right can be expanded upon, and then we need to invest, right? We need to identify food. You need to be intentional about the investment as we've been about the divestment and the disinvestment. Identify opportunities where food needs to be located. And then you look at the model. Is it a supermarket? Is it a CSA? Is it a farmer's market? Is it some other model that is going to allow for participation and full participation? And then, all right, how do we get people the ability to shop there, putting money into people's pockets, whether it's through a coupon program like the Health Buck program or through SNAP? All right, how do we ensure that the vendors that are there can accept everything that's available? How do we get innovative? And I actually think, Kiana, I know in things that you've written, you've talked about, we need to emulate states like Massachusetts that did the online WIC incentive. And we're piloting that here in New York now. And I do think we have partners on the state level who will sometimes need to be guided, but want to do the right thing. And that New York State is ripe for building these structures and building a more resilient food system. We can do this borough by borough. We can do it and do it as a city. Mm-hmm. I've kind of rambled, but.
No, I think that was great because you hit a lot of points. Oh, go ahead, Kiana.
Oh, no, I was just, I think it wasn't a ramble. I didn't mean to cut you off, Shekar.
No, I just wanted to say, I actually on that point, I mean, Michael, I want to go back to you in a minute on a couple of points you raised about agriculture, but I think you're, the point you're making about the way in which we need to actually get more literally cash in people's pockets to be able to buy food, like how that is such a, basic thing, but such a powerful way to actually increase the ability of people in their purchasing power when it comes to food, how important that is. And I wanted to just stick on that for a minute, Kiana, because Michael, you mentioned it too, but you talked about Massachusetts and you mentioned in the chat too, the importance of making sure that people can use SNAP to buy food at CSAs or farmers market. And if you can I talk about that a bit more? And it's interesting for me too, because in the context of, doing housing work with low-income tenants, all these benefits we see through one lens in that, it all helps to sustain the household, to be able to have enough cash otherwise to pay rent or to have public benefits to support families otherwise. From the food standpoint, can you talk a bit more, what's going on in Massachusetts now? How can New York kind of catch up to that? And what is the state of the use of SNAP for CSAs and farmers markets right now in New York City?
Yeah, and yes. So when I referenced Massachusetts, a couple of years ago, they leveraged a federal grant that's now known as like the Gus Schumacher grant, but in the past it was a Finney Large grant. And essentially it helps be a match. So you had to have matching funds, and then it offered like other funds. But what they did, what was really innovative and unique, was they had the SNAP benefits go electronically on the card. So if people were buying at direct to farm models like CSAs or farmers markets, their double up would automatically hit their card. And those extra, the additional incentives could be used elsewhere. But what they found was like a lot of people were continuing to use their incentive, their extra dollars at the farmers markets. And so like the amount of SNAP redemption went like up the roof, to the point where that grant like got exhausted really quickly, and they had to find new ways to fund it. And then in addition to that, there had been a SNAP pilot for CSAs as well, where the folks that were using SNAP, their card at the CSA, was also able to use it there. And I forget exactly some of the nuance around the pilot on the CSA, but it also helped support CSA and SNAP. So at farmers markets as well as CSAs, using an electronic card, because oftentimes some of even the smaller farmers markets or CSAs are still using vouchers. Not all, but some. And just the opportunity to have the benefits on your card electronically, the opportunity for the double up to happen almost instantaneously on your card, really makes a difference in terms of how people are leveraging their purchasing power. And, I heard about this years ago at like a food systems conference, and has been trying to talk about it in different meetings and such. So I'm really encouraged to finally see that we're here in our state, because if they're able to leverage that at the city level, and we have such, potential power here at our cities, why not? Like, why can't we figure out how to do that? But, I think in the years between, there was always this conversation of the barriers. And then you start to really question, what are real barriers to this work? Is it a policy barrier? Is it an electronic barrier, a tech barrier? Or is it just we never did it before? And I think what COVID also started to do is really start to show or put a light on how many of the barriers we've been bumping our heads against, whether in the grassroots or in work or trying to move bureaucracy, were not really that hard to move after all, or started to shift. So it's like, if this is this window of opportunity, if this is the challenge that we're faced, then we need to really expand and leverage these opportunities. So if there's, innovative policy that could be done, we should be doing that. Now, I don't want to get it, to get it confused for folks. CSAs have been able to accept SNAP. That's an advocacy measure that Just Food and other groups like Growing AC for years had tried to get. But there still are some hangups around how to do it efficiently. And I think these are the opportunities to continue to unpack that. And I think if we increase SNAP at CSAs, it helps increase economic equity, racial equity in a community food model that's built on farm viability. And I think that's something that's also important to lift up, is when we're talking about regional supply, kind of like what Michael's talking about, we want to make sure that we're supporting small farm viability, mid-scale farm viability, and we're going to need large-scale farms as well. But we shouldn't only find ways to leverage funding, relief funds or otherwise, to just the large scale. We really have a robust small and mid-scale regional food shed here. Something that we'll probably talk on a little bit later is when we talk about scale, it also then, and when you have this intersecting lens or idea around equity, then you start to see how they are separate, but yet intersect on each other. So Michael touched on the, conversation of, BIPOC farmers, or, some folks say BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous folk and people of color farmers. Yes, we have this disproportionate inequity of the number of BIPOC farmers or BIPOC farmers in our state. But to me, one of the ways to get more opportunities to support their viability isn't just because they're of color. We're going to have to figure out the scale for them to connect to our food, our food shed a little bit more, whether that's already in our communities in urban ag or connecting to some of the larger scale folks in the rural space. And of course, that will connect to like land stewardship and tenure. And something that I wanted to bring up too is in terms of policies and thinking forward about what a city government can do, I think we need to continue to push our city government, even through a budget crunch, even through a time, because again, this is when we hear we can't do the things. Yep. This is where justice starts to fall apart. And then we only do what we think are the emergency issues. Is we have to really start pushing around what does allocation around our city budget look like? How do we continue to support initiatives that are working well or make strides on changing some of the ways that they do engage with our community stakeholders? How do we find ways to bring in community groups into process, not at the end once the strategy is made, but early on? And are we building policies that are going to support infrastructure in our city to support genuine innovation and enterprise on the urban ag scale? And that can't just be ag tech. That can't just be vertical farms, and it can't just be hydroponic and rooftops. They sound great, a lot of costs, a lot of inputs, and a whole lot of healthy lettuce. But what we really need to do is start to hear from community folks that have been working in the breadth of urban agriculture around the policies that they want to see in urban ag. And I think when we start to hear from them, we start to hear around land tenureship, around underutilized land in our city, policies that support more access to that. I think, there's the majority of our community gardens are in parks. And those are under lease agreements. And I think while there's maybe continued efforts that can happen there, I think the opportunity for policy to support innovative land tenure in our city is going to be crucial, especially underutilized lands. And I think that can also look like other democratically controlled community land trusts that are not just for housing, but also for urban agriculture. So we're not unintentionally keeping out farmers of color, growers of color, producers of color, small businesses of color that are already in our community. And when I talk about infrastructure, it's not just gardens, it's not just urban farms. We're going to need to start seeing, hub and spoke models of community food hubs and facilities, processing, packing, not just hoping our, upstate partners are going to do it all and just bring it downstate. We need to start seeing this job creation here, and we need to have those policies that support that and don't unintentionally keep out the breadth of folks that have been doing soil-based work, other urban ag work here. So it is going to look like different urban ag policy. We can't just say we want to see urban farming. We need policies that's going to genuinely support it. We need to start redefining what profit looks like. And in the commons, when we grow in the commons, we need to start seeing genuine support and infrastructure that will connect our restaurant communities, our community gardens to our schools and other institutions. We need to see genuine inroads to scaled folks, producers, small businesses, to our good food purchasing and other procurement power. We need to see that in addition to the SNAP policy that Michael did a really good job talking about earlier.
That's a really important point, I think. And thank you for that explanation, Kiana, too, because that was actually the next topic. And by the way, for other people, we encourage you to start putting questions in the chat or submitting questions, because I have one more question to ask, and then we'll start going to, I see some already coming in through both Facebook as well as on our chat too. So we'll start to get to those. But Michael, I wanted to see if you wanted to add to that point as well. In terms of, you mentioned corporate agriculture before, and the importance of centering and supporting immigrant farmers, farmers of color, and how we do that. I think Kiana made some really good points about what we need to really see to support urban agriculture. So I'm just wondering, from your perspective, what are some of the ways that we could, in really two parts. One, support more local immigrant farmers in a holistic sense, in terms of to Kiana's last point, how do we get restaurants to really connect with them more? Or how do we get schools to connect with them more? And then as part of that, how do we also support the workers in that effort too? I know you've talked about this or written about it as well. So I just wanted you to kind of touch on that point too.
So I'll paint big picture and then back into what's happening on the ground. In the US, 88% of farms make less than $350,000 in gross income a year.
Wow.
Of them, majority lose every year. Okay. Despite operating 48% of all farmland and owning 40% of farm real estate, they account for 20% of gross income and only 5% of net income. So about 9% of US farms are making 95% of the profits in agriculture. And really, it's big agribusiness that controls our food system, right? We know 4 players control 90% of our grain trade. About 4 players control 70 to 80% of the pork industry. And it's why, without having direct access to a consumer through a CSA, through a farmer's market, or through a mission-driven micro hub like Kiana talks about, or a wholesale arm like our green market wholesale arm, farmers go out of business. And regardless of background, farmers are going out of business every day. And in the 50s in the US, when US agriculture policy was about farmers and putting money into farmers' pockets, the farmer took home about 41 cents of every food dollar. Today, it's somewhere between 15 to 17 cents. So it's never been harder to be a farmer. And but what do we need to do? We need to invest in agriculture, right? We need to invest in the people and the land. As Kiana said, you got to make land more affordable, whether it's through a community land trust, whether it's through the purchase of development rights. This is an environmental issue, it's an economic development issue, and it's an equity issue. We, 19 years ago, created a program at Grow NYC that worked exclusively with immigrant farmers that came to this country with ag experience. And the model we had deployed and that we've seen be incredibly successful is access to the technical assistance that you need to adapt those farming skills to the Northeast, access to land, access to capital, access to markets, right? And ongoing support. And what that has created is, 46, at least for us, 46 farm businesses that are owned by immigrant farmers, and that's being purchased and is now being passed on to the next generation, and a disproportionate impact on food security in New York City. So our Latinx producers that have come out of our program account for only 0.89% of green market farmland overall, but they take home 20% of the SNAP dollars that are spent at our markets and about 20% of the farmers market nutrition program dollars that are spent at our markets. Meaning that because they are growing food that is appropriate, because they are invested and selling it in communities that reflect them, they are playing a disproportionate impact and role in feeding their community. This needs to be propped up on steroids. We see new programs being developed, Northeast Farmers of Color, Black Farmer Fund, Soulfire, and these are all over, but those are some that in the Northeast on addressing gross issues of gross inequity. I think 85% of the farm labor in New York State is Spanish speaking, and only 3% of the management roles are Spanish speaking farmers. We partnered with Cornell through a USDA grant for a farm labor project that's teaching management skills, bilingual management skills that actually I could go through the course and be a better manager tomorrow. But it's how to really invest in moving up from farm worker to farm manager. There's an existing set, and then there's like management skills that need to be learned. We have another program in partnership with the Chester Ag Center and the Farm Hub in Kingston, investing in Spanish-speaking farmers that, again, want to own their own farm businesses on the Chester Ag Project. And again, it just needs to be vastly expanded, this work, and invested in. And again, that model of access to capital. It's a zero interest loan up to $10,000 where we put in the first 30%. Access land, helping navigate. Again, you're dealing with added challenges of race, of culture, and of a USDA that has neglected farmers of color for a long generations. And then ensuring that there is affordable land. You know, we know the land pressures. There's rural gentrification just like there's urban gentrification. We need to ensure that our retiring farmers, that land is staying in agriculture, and that our beginning farmers can afford that land.
That was really powerful, Michaelton. I like the concept you mentioned of rural gentrification versus urban gentrification, and the statistics are just staggering of the outsized influence. I mean, practically the entire market dominated by corporate agriculture. You know, I saw also Michael from the Queensboro, also who's here. Michael Fuquay also mentioned a point too about, so that was a good point to read, is community-based restaurants have a role to play in addressing food insecurity in our communities. The city and state contract with corporate vendors to provide prepared meals to seniors, schools, and homeless shelters. That money could be routed through independent, locally owned businesses and help them emerge from the pandemic and continue to serve local communities in ways that corporate vendors never will. And I thought that was such a great point too, just because that would be a way, I think Kiana also, you know, commented as well, it would be a way to support, you know, local community-based restaurants and small businesses, while also, to Kiana's point, ensuring that also local farmers are helped too, and also that culturally accessible food is also getting to seniors, immigrant families that we weren't seeing at all through the city's delivery programs during this pandemic too. So I just, you know, one thing I want to keep emphasizing, as you hear from our speakers too, is just how all of these systems are so interconnected and they all affect each other. The interlocking the inequities themselves are interlocking, and the solutions can be too. Another question I saw here that came up in our chat as well, for either of you is, and you kind of mentioned it too, but let's see. Some parents, guardians work multiple jobs and don't have time to prepare meals for their families and kids. What can we change to make sure children get nutritious, healthy meals, both at home and even also in our schools too? I think part of this is thinking about how we make our schools part of this food distribution system too.
Right. It's a really good question. I think there would be a lot of folks that would say it's a hard question or answer, or to answer, but I think, again, there's always community-driven solutions that can help. But I think what we're talking about is, like, if we're talking about farm to institution, if we're talking about how to get food into schools, I think there's ongoing efforts in our state to help create the relationships with that. I know, I mean, I'm not the only one. There are multiple people working on farm to institution. But I think what it's helpful to understand is our school system, the majority of the food is coming from, you know, corporate large scale food, and it's the processed food that you see. And there are continued efforts to improve school food, but we are going to need regional, not just contracts for those farmers. They are going to need to know and work with school and procurement coordinators and farm to school coordinators on not just identifying the farmers, but also identifying recipes and meals that are culturally relevant as well. So I think it's it can be answered in many ways. I think one, it's the realization that if we truly want to scale up our regional food supply and connect it to institutions of our scale, like schools, then we're going to need to support the infrastructure and supply chain of multiple farmers. So that is, you know, oh, sorry.
Oh, I said that's it. Sorry. I didn't realize that. I'm nodding out loud.
You're affirming.
But yeah, you know, so we're talking about value-based procurement. We're talking about procurement at a higher scale. And I think we need to divest from this idea that only large-scale suppliers can do that. I think what we need are resources and infrastructure to support small to mid-scale regional farmers to be able to leverage the power of procurement, the power of aggregation to connect to meet these contracts and meet these needs. And the farmers that are primed to do so, to be able to actually build these genuine relationships with the procurement coordinators that they're going to need in order to do that. And that can happen in large scale bids, right? And then they can happen in smaller bid contracts. I think there's, again, always like some community-based work that happens and smaller, like programs that connect schools to food, or CSAs at food boxes and stuff. But if we're really talking about like the food in the school, we're talking about institution. And I think we're talking about scaling up or resources or capital around supporting farmers getting land to grow diversified crops, fruits and vegetables, livestock in a healthy, sustainable way where they can meet those margins and get it into the contracts and have that demand be consistent, and have contracts that are built so these farmers are actually able to do this and support the work that they're doing. And again, if we only look at ways to procure from large scale, we're oftentimes going to miss the opportunity to bring in cultural urban food. I don't want to mistake the opportunities, again, that are at the urban ag level, because I think in smaller contracts and smaller bids or opportunities, and urban meaning whatever your city or community is, there are urban farms, community groups, land on CLT land and such that are able to connect to contracts. And again, if we have resources going to their systems, they're able to scale up in business, where oftentimes these are not lands that are being grown to production, and also understand how to manage a contract like this. This is like something once you're in, you have to be able to do it well and be consistent. I think we're seeing opportunities, but I think there's, again, barriers around it. And I think we, again, need policies that are going to support and other additional work to support the infrastructure that is needed for people not to just buy land or to grow on land, but to be able to have the facilities, the supply chains, the logistics needed to get that food, whether it's from a community garden to a school or from our rural lands upstate, downstate, in order to get it. And then the processing facilities that it takes, because oftentimes we're not just talking about whole food. Sometimes, things need to be chopped or prepped or frozen. And we need facilities to kind of do that and not just relying on the existing food hubs or facilities upstate. These are, again, opportunities that can happen here in our city if the infrastructure and policies there to support it.
There's some, Keanu summed it up. I think it doesn't have to be as hard as we make it to be. I think we can start with products. That's it. Identify where they grow well. What is the strategic infrastructure investment that needs to be made? What does the city want to invest in? What's the state? Where do we leverage the feds? Where can philanthropy come in? And then how do you plug the small farms around there into those opportunities to participate in this new market?
Yeah.
The one thing I do want to say is I don't think it's fair to say that the city failed in their response to COVID. I think that this was an unprecedented virus that no one knew how it was going to impact us, and it was scary. And they had it was a new need overnight on top of an existing need that was overwhelming. We're working with systems, again, that are not sustained, that are not creative. And I think that Kate McKenzie, who's the food policy coordinator, has done a hell of a job in a very short period of time in a very difficult situation. And I thought Commissioner Garcia actually did a great job and cut through, like Yana said, people were able to try things for the first time that bureaucracy used to get in the way of. And they did some things really well. And they did, and some of the contracts put out there were not very good. And I think they discontinued them as soon as they possibly could, because that was the last thing that they wanted to be doing. I think that Kate very much understands these issues well and is going to try to move a very large boat as fast as she can.
And on that point too, to Kiana's point as well, and then, Michael, just think we think about you look at New York City, their purchasing power as government is so large, right? Like whether it comes to food for schools, senior centers, distribution centers, what can the city do to really ensure that purchases and contracts are going towards smaller farmers as well, right? Not just like urban agriculture, that's really important too, but even right outside New York City as well. Is there programs that they should be reorienting in some ways that, require purchases from certain farms and only certain, size farms too? Or how can the city really take a more hands-on role in defining how their purchasing power is used, if that makes sense?
Well, Kiana may disagree with me on this.
That's good. We like disagreements. Good for discussion.
I think it goes back to the last answer, that the city can invest in the infrastructure that small farms need in order to be able to bring their product to that market. And that the farmers, it then is on the farmers to be able to do that, and invest in the know-how, the knowledge, and create every opportunity for those small farms to be successful and have real marketplaces. The other thing is there's been a huge conversation about divestment, right? And where our budget goes, and taking funding from the NYPD and investing in real resources that sustain us.
Oh yeah.
So, there's lots of money out there. It's just how do we want to spend it? And the other thing is, we constantly talk about that needs to be, food can be cheap. Food is us, but make it so that the money is there and that it's accessible. But cheap food is the start of the problem. When we're driving it down to the lowest price, and then we're going to deal with the health and environmental issues. And also it means that we're not paying people that are participating in our food system. Because if the farmer is getting the lowest price, they're not paying. They're not going to farm in an environmental stewardship manner, and nor are they going to pay their workers along the supply chain. And if we want 99 cent per pound chicken, then who's slaughtering those birds? Who's processing those birds? How much are they getting paid? What are their protections? So it all need to be rethought.
Yeah.
Can
I do?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not that I disagree with Michael, but I think coming from a grassroots perspective and seeing and hearing from farmers that could have pivoted. Like I distinctly remember talking to a farmer, Freebird Farm, where once the Nourish money came to be, then the majority of that money went to large scale, straight to food banks and large scale suppliers. We try to find a way to build relationships for small and mid-scale farmers to access those funds. And for every one farm we were able to do, and they did it well, they pivoted well and got healthy food to an immediate response like a food bank. There are farmers that funding came too late, or this reliance on an emergency model came too late, or even in the response, when Get Food rolled out, something that I mentioned in the chat. I guess what I'm trying to say, and I can rattle off multiple examples of what I'm trying to talk about. I guess what I'm trying to say is all the pivots that happen in our system was challenging and unprecedented. I do think because the city historically, and maybe also just from the expertise of our food policy director at the time, the reliance on the emergency model, even though we've had existing community food system leaders, work organizations, food justice organizations, who were not privy to these conversations or building strategies, we missed out. And we can talk about it after the fact, how we missed out, but there's no reason why those partners weren't at the table. So what we can do now, so I'm a little more critical, is what I'm saying. But what we can do now is see what did we miss, and there's a report that I can share, and I want to shout out Maggie, who's on the call, who did a great job on this report and worked with Just Food. What we heard from our partners was, in the midst of COVID, when there were groups that do food justice work, growing, or farmers or livestock folks, the money, the resources weren't there to support them in their pivots as much in their immediate or emergent responses. And to me, there's a difference between immediate and emergent response. So you had farmers that would have been able to get us New York State chicken and meet these contracts that weren't able to leverage the opportunities that were really built for larger scale. So if we're going to move forward in resiliency, we have to start thinking differently about how we build contracts, who we engage, how we build the strategies to get there. And that's something I would want to see from you if you win, or other city government officials, is when it's time to make those plans and those relationships, don't call the community after the fact to say our bad. Call the community groups and leaders that have that knowledge. And it's not just the same 2 or 3 folks of color, but like the food systems that have the organizations that have those relationships, and say, what would resiliency look like? What would a pivot look like that supports small farmers? How do we do this realistically? And something that also came up for us, and what I heard in the report, and I heard from other people offline too, is even in the midst of their pivots, many food justice organizations, CSAs, try to jump in and do extra work with mutual aid. Farmers, small mid-scale farmers, were donating to all the different efforts, but there was no money towards these donations to these foods. It's a different donation scale from large scale to small farmers. Same on the community side. If you have a community garden who's focused on growing food, and then they had to pivot to where the resources and the boxes were coming from, commodity food and commodity boxes, you're not going to not feed your community. You're not going to try to figure out how to do that. But there was no money in those systems towards labor. So people had to make a choice very fast to do the growing that we can and should do in the midst of COVID with the social distancing measures that we needed, or do emergency distribution. Many tried to do both, but what ended up happening is some of the models were having to navigate or juggle between doing food justice and food sovereignty work, their existing work with no funds, or pivoting to just emergency food. And if we're going to move forward, that's not a pivot that's going to keep our neighborhoods whole moving forward. We can't keep pivoting or making like Nourish got 3 rounds of funding. We can't keep pivoting it so it only supports certain scale farmers. We need to think about the money that's made available and figure out ways to really support longer viable systems. How do we support CSAs longer? How do we support farmers markets longer? How do we support our farmers longer? So we have a landscape that's really a breadth of food, healthy food access and options. And there's a dignity of the food and a choice to where folks grow. Sorry, I'm looking at time. I'm like just rattling off. I apologize.
No, not at all. That was actually really very.
Sorry, I just totally I went on a rant. Sorry. I told you what happens when I talk after 8 o'clock.
No, that was great. I think it was really important to hear. And that's excellent points you made too. I don't know, Michael, if you want to add anything to that, or if you have any thoughts further on that point.
I apologize. It's late.
No, not at all. That was great.
Why would I comment after that? But I fully agree. And I mean, it's about rethinking our system as a whole, and what expertise looks like, and who needs to be part of the conversation. What's interesting is this response was light years better than after Sandy. Right, when it was just MREs coming in, like from the National Guard, that was our food response, to where we actually were talking about real food. But that's right. I mean, again, from the USDA program, particularly, but also Nourish, it is geared to support industrial agriculture.
Right, clearly.
That's who lost all the corporate accounts, right? And so, people were dumping products because their supply chains were gone. But you know what? Our markets closed for 2 days because not because of product availability, but because we had to learn how to operate our markets in COVID.
Yep.
We could do that safely. And then we were able to provide some of the safest shopping options and retail options in the city, and created vital lifelines for farmers and for communities to have access. And so it's those relationships and it's those direct supply chains and non-decentralized supply chains that we just need to continue to invest in, but be intentional about it. It has to be as intentional as it was to create the system that we have. The system that we have worked very well. It just doesn't work for a lot of people.
Exactly.
And I think what's an important point, and just noticing that we should probably, close to and being conscious of time, but is that Kenny made a point too about, and both of you are saying this, this is really a systemic problem, in that we have to really think about food supply to distribution to purchasing power, from farm to farmers market to CSAs. It seems that it's critical that we have the community groups on the ground who are doing this work every day be part of that conversation from the start, right? Because we're thinking about, it seems like, I think part of the things that we want to talk about is just how this is all so connected. It's connected across which communities are affected most by it. It's connected to public benefits. It's connected to housing, small businesses. And ultimately, if the city wants to ensure that its purchasing power is used for good to actually support small farmers, it's also just as important to make sure that on the distribution end, it gets to the intended people and communities that are not getting this food anyway, right? And so it seems like having the community groups at the table from the very start of these conversations, especially during a pandemic, becomes so important too. So I think that point is critical. And I do think that both of you raising how much this is a systemic issue is so important too. So I thank you both so much. This was such a great conversation too. I really enjoyed it a lot. I think it gives us a lot to think about coming out of this pandemic, because no matter how you view what the city could have done differently during the pandemic or what it did do, the fact of the matter is there's so much more coming out of it that I think COVID has revealed that we need to overhaul our food distribution systems and food policy in our city, because this problem existed long before COVID, and at this rate, it will exist long after COVID too. So, and I'm just grateful that we had both of you tonight too, to think about these issues, because the real work ahead of us is really rebuilding our city by prioritizing our most vulnerable communities too, when it comes to food as well. So thank you, Kiana. Thank you, Michael, so much. Thank you all for joining for tonight's conversation too. It was a great discussion, I thought, and look forward to many more conversations like this in the future too. So thank you all so much, and have a good night too.
Yeah, have a good night, everybody.
Bye. This was a great conversation. I love it.
Michael.
No, don't worry. This was awesome.
Thank you, Shekar.
Yeah, absolutely. Bye, everyone. Have a good night.